Hi there, I'm Cliff Henricksen, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the personalized amplification system family of products. There are a lot of complaints about amplified music today, and the complaints come from everybody. They come from the players themselves, they come from the players' bandmates, and worst of all, they come from the audience. As a musician, I've been playing well over 30 years. I've had to fight against them every time I went on to play a show, and you know what they are too because you've been fighting against them yourselves. So as a musician, I was really motivated to solve these, even just for my own life as a musician. But as an engineer, the problems and the possibility of a solution became really, really fascinating. And eventually, at the end of our research, we found out that there was an entire systematic approach to playing amplified music that created all of these big problems. And so, having found the source of the problem and problems, we decided to do something about it. The traditional approach to amplified music is what we've come to call the triple system approach. We're all very familiar with it. There are three distinctly different elements. These are the backline speakers, the monitors, and the PA or the house system. The backline speakers. They're typically used for electric guitars, basses, and keyboards. And these were holdovers from the era of individual instrument amplification because they were considered an essential part of the instrument's sound. The monitors. These are speakers that are pointed away from the audience and toward the musicians and up in the air. They're intended to give each musician their own sound mix. And finally, the PA or front of house system. This is pointed away from the musicians and toward the audience. It supplies enough level to the audience without introducing excessive levels on stage. The triple systems approach was developed back in the 1960s to solve a very basic problem. Let me explain. As you know, loudspeakers are very loud when you're close to them. And as you move away, the sound level falls off quickly. So if the sound level is adjusted correctly for the stage like this, it's not going to be loud enough out in the audience, especially in larger venues. If you try to adjust the levels correctly for the audience, like this, it will be too loud on stage. Or you get the kind of feedback from microphones and instrument pickups that comes from excessive amplification. And so the triple system really did solve a basic problem of sound in the audience and sound on stage by separating the two. And it worked. Unfortunately, it created other problems that seriously affect the playing of music. For example, there's an enormous amount of equipment to load in and load out. And the equipment is extremely complex. A typical mixing console has almost 500 controls, each one with the potential to ruin the sound if set incorrectly. And there are 50 or more cable connections to be made, yet a single broken cable can have a disastrous consequence. Dozens of electronic devices are connected together, any two of which can cause a hum or a buzz that can literally take hours to eliminate. That is, if it can be found at all. The triple system also causes some serious sonic problems. Here's one. We instinctively connect what we hear with what we see. And we turn our attention to that in order to understand it better. This ability also enhances our appreciation of music. In an acoustic music performance, if the audience hears something of particular interest, such as a solo, they automatically turn our heads to see where the sound is coming from. With a triple system, however, they can't do this. The sound comes from the direction of the nearest PA speaker, and they don't know which way to turn to see what's making the sound. It's rare when instruments are panned properly on the mixing console, so the audience's attention gets divided between hearing the music and trying to connect it with what they see. This compromises a deeper experience of the live performance. For performers, there's also a loss of eye and ear connection. Voices and instruments come from the direction of the monitors, typically at their feet, and not from the direction of fellow musicians, which are off to the sides of the stage. Musicians told us that under these circumstances, it's easy to lose critical musical cues and miss out on the musical ideas of their fellow players because they're trying to connect sight with sound. Here's another problem. There's a fascinating property of our hearing system called the cocktail party effect. The cocktail party effect comes into play in environments where there are lots of competing sound sources, such as at a cocktail party. Amazingly, we can concentrate on anyone talking and understand what they're saying. You can turn your attention to someone to the left, for example, and hear and understand what they're saying. Or you can turn your attention to someone on the right and hear them too. However, if you try to take those same two talkers and move them to the same location in space, we know from many studies that you're unable to distinguish what either of them is saying. And yet, that's exactly what happens with monitors. Signals from different instruments and voices are electronically combined into one signal and then radiated from a single location, the monitor, and can therefore become difficult or impossible to hear clearly. The audience has the same problem. They hear everything mixed and coming from the PA speaker to which they're closest. Their inability to enjoy the benefits of the cocktail party effect is one important reason they complain of unintelligible lyrics and garbled instruments. Another reason why instruments and voices are hard to hear is excessive reverberation. Triple amplification systems create lots of reverberation because the three independent speaker systems flood the room with reflections that bounce around and create reverberation. Here you can see how the unwanted sound is radiated to the upper walls and ceiling. Too much reflected sound makes it hard to hear the sound coming directly from the speakers. The problem gets progressively worse as the full complement of PA speakers, monitors, and backline speakers are added. The monitor speakers are especially problematic when it comes to generating reverberation. They're pointed toward the back wall and upwards at the ceiling, and the sound is reflected into the ceiling and then back into the room. If you wanted to create reverberation, which you don't, monitors would be one of the very best ways to do it. I'd like to talk about backline speakers now. And of course, as a musician, I love guitar amps, the classic backline speaker. But as an acoustical engineer, I have to tell you, it creates some very real problems acoustically. Guitar players almost never stand in front of their amplifiers. That's because their backline speakers are so directional that the level of audio directly in front is incredibly intense and harsh. But the audience members are in the direct line of fire and get blasted by the guitar sound. Even if it's not a loud show, they still hear a mix that's inappropriately dominated by the guitar. The musicians on stage don't fare very well either. Either they're on axis of the guitar and therefore get swamped by its sound, or they're off axis and only hear a dull and far away version of the instrument that's hardly representative of the tone carefully created by the guitarist. And often the reality of this is that the only person really getting the good guitar sound is the guitarist. Now, all these problems that we've discussed, they're big problems. They really get in the way of how we play and how we make music. But they pale compared to this next problem that we're going to talk about. Now, this next problem strikes at the very heart of how musicians connect with their audiences. In a triple system approach, as we've seen, the instruments are electronically mixed one way for the audience through the front PA system, and a different way for each musician through the monitor system. This mixing is done by a sound operator positioned in the audience. In such an arrangement, the musicians initiate the sound, but then they immediately lose control of it to the person operating the mixing board. They don't control how they sound to themselves, and they don't control how the sound is relayed to their fellow musicians. And yet the person who does have control can't hear what they're doing because they're not on stage. In the case of the PA mix for the audience, musicians have no idea what the person operating the mixing console has done to their sound. So that explains why the most common thing you hear when musicians walk off stage after a show using a triple system is, "How did we sound?"
You can never be fully aware of what's happening out there.
You can't hear what's going on.
Go after the show to the sound man, you go, so how was it? You know, you're all excited, and he goes, oh, it was awful.
There's a huge disconnect between the sound guy and the performer.
I played shows where I've been like, that's the worst show ever, and then my manager will come up to me and say, Mike, it sounded awesome.
Depends where you sit, too.
Never knew, not from where I was. It was horrible.
And I'm standing in front of my monitor, and everybody's coming through this little monitor.
And you're sort of stuck in this, like, this vortex of mess.
You wind up playing to a speaker half the time because that's where your sound is coming from.
You start wasting energy and unconsciously adjusting the sound you're making to enhance the sound that, you know, the reproduction of it that you're getting back.
It interferes with music making.
Well, we've talked about a bunch of different problems that get in the way of musicians being able to hear themselves and being able to hear each other for musical communication so they can play together. And all of these problems get right to, they all add up to, and they all get right into the heart of the cause of excessive levels. And let me explain how this works. We've studied these problems where there's all this jumble on stage, or three systems. There's a lot of clutter, and really people can't make out what's going on. And so the first thing they will do, especially if you have an amplifier, turn it up a little bit so you can at least hear yourself. And when that happens, you affect what everybody else hears on stage, and they turn it up a little bit more, and it gets louder and louder. And now people are going to start to put earplugs in their ears on stage, cuts all the high end, and it makes things even less distinct. And it's a known psychoacoustic fact, even without earplugs, the louder you get, the less you can make out detail and subtlety and clarity. And so you have this escalation of sound level on stage. What happens then is that all the stage volume gets out into the audience, and it interferes with the front of house mix. So what happens there? Same thing that happens on stage. The front of house mixer turns the level of the front of house up. And so now the audience starts wearing earplugs, and it gets louder out front. Some of it washes back in on stage. It's less distinct, and it's this thing that blows up.
You tend to get in volume wars a lot.
The bass gets louder, the drummer gets louder, the guitar player gets louder.
Then I sing louder.
Everything's rising up, and you're still struggling to be able to hear yourself.
This is way too loud.
We sell earplugs here.
By the end of the band's set, all you hear is, the ringing in your ears.
I love live music, but when it's too loud, it's not fun.
Now, people really do like loud levels in rock and roll music and all kinds of music, but the volume levels have definitely gotten excessive.
One person can't hear themselves. They bring their level up, and another person now is not hearing what they want to hear.
Anybody turns up a little bit, someone else is going to turn up.
It's like a chain reaction.
There's just too much sound coming off stage.
It's always got to be way, way too loud.
It was just a really unpleasant sound.
Hearing this mush come through the speakers and really not being able to hear the show.
It's almost we're damned by the technology that we've developed over the years.
I left. I put my fingers in my ears and I walked towards the door.
And so the triple system really did solve the problem of sound being very loud close to normal speakers and soft far away. And it did this by separating the stage and the audience sound. But of course, in doing this, created all these problems. So in thinking about a better way and a different way to do sound for amplified music, we decided very early on that if we could find a loudspeaker that sounded the same to the musicians as well as it did to the audience, we'd be there. We realized that if we used a sound source shaped like a flagpole, tall and thin, that it would have some unusual and very beneficial properties. A source shaped like this can produce wedge-shaped sound waves that expand out into the sides, but hardly up and down at all. This wedge-shaped radiation pattern changed many things. It greatly reduces reverberation by not radiating sound to the upper walls and ceiling. And because it confines its energy to a wedge-shaped pattern, the level drops off significantly more slowly than a traditional loudspeaker. It creates a large, uniform sound field. If you build such a sound source thinly enough, the radiation pattern looks something like this. Take a look at this top view of a stage. Rather than a directional pattern of a conventional speaker, such a source spreads the sound almost at 180 degrees. Such a source can be made to work for any individual musician. And if every musician in the ensemble had one, they hear each other as in an acoustical performance, and they play with the knowledge that the same sound they hear on stage is what is projected into the audience. The musicians and no one else are in complete control of the music. Such a system represents a fraction of the equipment required in a triple system. There are no monitors, no PA, no backline speakers, no mixing consoles, no snakes. Only a few electrical connections to make. Setup and tear down occur in minutes, not hours. In such an approach, everyone, musicians and members of the audience, enjoy the benefits of the cocktail party effect because each instrument's sound is separated in space rather than mixed together and radiating from a single location. Everyone enjoys the benefit of eye-ear coordination because now the sound comes from the musician's position, not a PA speaker off to one side or another. There isn't a bad seat in the house. You can get up and move around and always get good balanced sound and an accurate sonic perspective. This is the Bose cylindrical radiator loudspeaker, the heart of the personalized amplification system. The cylindrical radiator loudspeaker plugs into a power stand that contains all of the necessary electronics and amplification. A remote control connects to the power stand and can be placed wherever it's convenient for the musician. This is what gives the control back to the musicians. For many instruments, most vocalists, horn players, acoustic guitarists, and most stringed instruments, nothing else is needed. For instruments that use lots of bass, keyboards, bass guitar, kick drum, one or more small bass modules can be driven from the amplification built into the power stand. No additional equipment is required. Because there's so much less equipment, and because the equipment is so portable, there's a huge time and cost saving